Bonjour, Anine. My name is Marlene Gallagher. I am Anishinaabe from Saugeen First Nation, which is also known as Fort Alexander. I attended residential school, and I was also a part of the 60 Scoop. I am a wife, I am a mother, and I am a sister. I am a kukum. I've spent many years working in the education system. I attained a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Education and a History Honors degree from the University of Winnipeg. And I also have a master's degree in education from the University of Manitoba. I also do volunteer work with some boards. One is in education and the other one is dealing with health. So today I'm going to also talk about what are some of the issues that relate to residential schools. Well, we know the impact of residential schools has been wide-reaching, and this can include, but is not limited to, physical and mental health. Changes to cultural practices, weakened language systems, and loss of family connections. I'm only saying that, those are some of the impacts and issues today, because we know there are far many more that impact Indigenous people. And of course, we know that the residential schools are just a reminder of one of the biggest injustices that has occurred in Canada. And unfortunately, some of these injustices continue, from many generations. So when we talk about that, what is the relationship like today for residential school survivors, and with that of government and different organizations? So we know the relationship between Indigenous peoples and government is always changing. And that dates back over 100 years where, things have always changed. So whenever there is a change in government, there's also a change in ideologies. And those ideologies don't always blend with our Indigenous worldviews. And in some ways that can create conflict. It can be difficult to understand this complex relationship in light of the massive wrongdoing at the residential schools. There's a lot of different perspectives on this relationship, good and bad. And, it's important for us to try and work with everyone, all Canadians in a sense. But we also know this relationship will need continuous work now and for future generations. But we know Indigenous people have a much louder voice today than we did, 20 years ago, or, especially when you go even, 50 years ago. There were so many things that really didn't change for Indigenous people until the late 70s. And we're continuously seeing these changes which impact these relationships as well. Now, my personal experience with residential schools is, of course, like I indicated earlier, I attended residential school at the age of 5, along with my older brother, who was 8 years old at the time. I still remember being so scared when we were taken to the school and then having my hair shaved off, which historically was done to every child that ever attended residential school. And it didn't matter if it happened in, 50 years prior or, whatever. Any child that went there had this experience. And at the time, I really didn't understand why they had to cut my hair. And, we never had our hair cut until we went there. And that's one of our traditions, was to ensure that the children's hair was kept long, because we know the sacred connections of our hair to Mother Earth. And so for that reason, we know now that, cutting our hair was trying to disconnect us from our culture. And of course, I really didn't understand that until I was much older. I mean, when you're 5 years old or 8 years old, it's not something you really put a lot of thought into or think about. Why are they doing this? It's just a bad experience that you're going through, and you simply don't understand why it's happening to you. And we know that this was really only the beginning of the assault on our identity, like my identity. And for me, it was, like I said, it was scary. And of course, that assault on our identity, it didn't just stop at our identity. It included an attack on our language, our cultural practices. These are things we were never allowed to do in the school. We were never allowed to speak our language. You couldn't, go to a sweat lodge or anything like that. And of course, for me, Ojibwe was my first language. And that was the only language we spoke at home as a child. And I lived with my family, but my grandparents lived with us, which again, wasn't that uncommon for our families because, we were this big family unit and we had all those supports to help raise the children. And that was the same in our family. And so it's hard to understand why some families were targeted over others. And so, like many children that attended these residential schools, I lost much of my language while I was in the school as well, for the lack of not being able to use it. And of course, I was one of the fortunate ones because I was able to regain some of the language that I had forgotten. And I have friends who lost their language for good, and they might know some words, but really they've lost that piece of their identity, that piece of their culture. And I might get a little rusty because I don't really practice it every single day either, but I at least was able to gain most of it back and to be able to communicate with family, especially my mother, because my mother hardly spoke any English. So for her, if I hadn't been able to regain what I had lost in the language, communicating with her would have been difficult. And it's the same for a lot of us who had, Kukums and Mishoms who, didn't speak English very well. How do we communicate with them when we finally returned back into our communities or, reconnected with our families? But I think for myself, the most difficult experience of attending residential school was, feeling lonesome, missing my family. And, you feel a certain sense of abandonment and isolation in this strange place. And you lose that family connection. Those ties are severed in the name of assimilation. And it was to make us better people. I guess it depends whose perspective, but I didn't see it that way, and I still don't. Because to me, taking me away from my family did not make it any better for anyone attending these schools. In fact, most of us would come out of there quite traumatized from an experience that we would never have endured if we had been left with our families. We all came from loving, caring families. And it doesn't mean we didn't have our problems, but it was still an environment that was much better, being raised in your culture to understand who you are and, develop skills that you would need as an adult. And those are skills we never really learned in the school. And I mean, one of the biggest ones is, of course, the parenting. And we see that today where, we have so many kids in care. And I was part of that system. And so that makes that even worse, knowing that, we had residential schools, but that whole piece has continued with us being in care, and that's still happening today. But I also remember always being hungry and not liking the food, which was often repetitive, like having porridge every morning. But what I think I disliked the most was the powdered milk that we had to drink or use in our porridge. And so quite often I didn't bother drinking the milk because I thought it tasted terrible. So I would just eat the porridge the way it was, or just having bread with the porridge, not really toasted or, and that was just something that was forced upon us. Poor nutrition often led to children being sick. We didn't get enough of the fruits and vegetables, and we didn't always get meat in our meals either. So when you come from a traditional family where, you're living off the land, you get to eat fish, you get to eat, rabbit and deer meat and moose and stuff like that. We were actually much healthier because we had a much healthier diet than when we got to the school. And so a lot of kids were getting sick, and it didn't matter if it was in the 1930s or in the 1950s. These things were happening all along. And even though government knew these things were happening, nothing would change for any of us. And we know that, abuse was wide-ranging, and children were physically abused daily, and of course, like for myself, I know going into the school, my English was very poor. So of course there was a language barrier. And because of that language barrier, I didn't always understand what I was being told to do. One of the jobs I had was washing floors in the step. Even at the age of 5, we were having to do chores every day. And so not doing something fast enough or not doing it the way you were told would, you would get a smack across the head. And to this day, that's something that still really bothers me. And trying to speak your language, you would get punished. I remember, getting a strap on my hand because I was trying to speak my language. So none of the children were allowed to do this. And I guess the one thing the residential schools did succeed in doing is making the children feel ashamed of the culture, of our culture. And I know I have friends that basically, they refused to speak their language because they were scared to. Or in some cases, our families didn't want to speak the language because they thought it would be a detriment to their children learning that part of their culture. I was fortunate that my family were open and for me to learn the language again. And of course, they also took away any of our traditional practice. After leaving the school, a lot of us had to reconnect with that. And it wasn't always easy reconnecting or even going back to your community, because in a way you felt like you really didn't belong with your family because you looked at things so differently. Because when you're in the school, you're brainwashed to believe that your culture is inferior. You're made to believe that anything to do with your family, that they were, they would hold you back and that they were a bad influence. And that was certainly the case for my family. We didn't see our mom very often because she was told that, we didn't want to see her. And at the same time, we were told the same thing, that, she just didn't come anymore because, she was doing other things and didn't want to see us anymore. And that was just another way of breaking that family tie and that disconnection for the children. And, we also have to remember, though, that the family members that were left behind when children were taken. I was the youngest in my family, so I had older siblings. And although they didn't physically attend these residential schools, the impact on them in some cases were just as bad. The impact, is quite often untold for those that didn't attend, but, they still were impacted, because how do you, look at your younger siblings who were taken away and you weren't, because maybe you were too old, or for whatever reason, they maybe only had, 2 beds and they only needed to find 2 children to fill those beds at the school. So there were different reasons why children weren't taken, and some were. And of course, the younger we were, the easier it was for them to, change who we were. So of course, those family members, quite often were struggling with this whole, idea that, what do we do now? We've lost some family members to the school. And so for many, like some of my older siblings, alcohol drowned that pain. Even if it was only temporary. All of this contributed to, of course, my family being dysfunctional, which is not uncommon in our communities. And we see that even today. And those are intergenerational impacts we see, through many different generations of children, where we pass on some of what we learned in these schools. So, of course, after leaving the residential school, my brother and I lived with family for a short time. We were able to live with my aunt for a short time until she registered us at a school, and they discovered that she actually wasn't our legal guardian. In fact, we were, and if people don't know this, most kids coming out of residential schools were wards of the government. So the government, in a sense, was actually our legal guardian. And so as a result of that, we were again taken away from family. And we then became part of the 60 Scoop and placed into foster homes. So I stayed in foster homes until I was 18 years old, and I lived in 3 different foster homes during that time. And I'm still fortunate in so many ways, because, when I was about 14 or 15, I was able to reconnect with my mom when I was living in one of the foster homes. And I was able to maintain that connection and try and rebuild, a relationship that, from the time I was 5, when I was taken, we had lost so much. So now we were trying to regain that mother-daughter relationship. And it wasn't always easy. But in the end, we did the best we could. And, I was given an opportunity to spend time with my mother. And unfortunately, she died young. So I was still, I still say that I was blessed to have the years I did with her. And a lot of families never made it back together. So I guess in light of that, at least I was able to see my family again. Now, when we talk about families and relationships, we also have to look at how does the government and churches, how are they dealing with residential schools? And we hear a lot today in the media as to what's going on. So for me, I think, some of the things I've thought about is, the government made a formal apology to residential school survivors and their families going back to 2008. That's some time ago. And I remember when that apology came out, I thought to myself, it would have been nice if my mom had been alive to actually hear that, because she's the one that had her children taken away from her, but yet she never got to hear that apology. And of course, before we had that apology, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was actually established, with the commission releasing a report in December of 2015 with 94 calls to action. And these all go back to, what is the government doing? But according to an article I was reading on the National Post, and this was just from this year, June of 2021, said 6 years after the TRC released its 94 calls to action, the vast majority of them haven't yet to be fully implemented, much to the frustration of Indigenous experts, leaders, and of course, activists. So that's 6 years already where that report came out. And I myself too thought that we would have more of those calls to actions addressed, or at least coming close to, being finalized and addressing what was called for. Now, many of these calls to action were on track to be completed years ago. And the things that came up that really surprised me too was, there was a call for an Indigenous language commissioner. We know with the loss of our language, there's a lot of language programs out there. So having an Indigenous language commissioner would be very beneficial, or a national council for reconciliation. And that should also be in place by now. The fact that residential school records have not been released in 6 years, and since the report, that alone in itself also speaks volumes to me anyway. What we really need is meaningful action, not just more promises. I hear a lot of promises, but I want to also see the action. And for a lot of our survivors, it's important for them to see some of these things come to fruition, because we lose survivors every year. And when we lose them every year, these are things that they're never going to get to see to happen in their lifetime. So I think it's even more important for us to have these things happen, now and in the near future. But we know the federal government is responsible for taking leadership and to ensure that some of these actions, towards reconciliation actually happen. Working in partnership with Indigenous peoples, it's equally important for all Canadians to participate and commit their time to learn and understand the history of Indigenous peoples. And I know there's many partnerships with, through government, where they work with, post-secondary institutions, they work with schools, children are learning about the treaties in the school through curriculum or residential schools. So these things are always happening. So that's my little piece when talking about what do I see the government doing in relationship to reconciliation. I think we have a long way to go, but we have made, some advancements, but I think we need to continue to use our Indigenous voices to push more of that forward. Now, many religious institutions also support the search of the unmarked graves, as did the government. They put out a budget that would help in trying to bring some closure for the families who have lost these children from years ago and during the residential school era. And of course, a lot of the churches have, contributed to various events, including the search for the children. Many have made public statements of apology and have shown their commitment to work with Indigenous leaders and their communities, while others refuse to apologize for these atrocities at the schools. So again, we're going to have, some religious institutions that are fully supportive, others not so much. And again, that's where I think we've hit a roadblock why some of the records have not been released. So if the churches or religious institutions are truly sincere in a true path toward reconciliation, I think some of their first steps would be to release these records that were requested by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think waiting 6 years past when the report was released speaks volumes. And I think we need to address that in the near future. So personally, I don't believe we should be asking the government or these religious institutions for an apology. I know some have given them, but I think rather, in my opinion, they should be asking us for forgiveness as well, because what, the individuals that worked in these schools did, they were working for the church and in partnership with government. And I think that's my reasoning for them asking for our forgiveness. But how do we move forward from all of this? How do we move forward with our healing? Well, given the complexity of the historic trauma for Indigenous peoples, it is clear that disrupting the intergenerational transmission of trauma will require a holistic and a multifaceted approach to improving our health and well-being. And we have many organizations that are working with survivors and the families to help us with this process. Now, the effects are still being felt by individuals, families, communities, and even our nations. And of course, these effects play out daily in our, all facets of our life. So interrupting, this transmission of trauma is going to require an approach that not only treats the symptoms, but will require healing and rebuilding of each of us, our families, and of course, within our communities as well. A key factor to our healing is to reestablish a sense of pride. And I see that when I work with schools, a lot more of our Indigenous youth are proud of who they are, and that's what we need. They're proud of their culture and they're not afraid to show it. And of course, the collective identity is also needs to be worked on, through our traditional practices. And I thank my ancestors for teaching us and continuing to teach us about our traditional practices throughout the residential school system. Otherwise, we might not have, some of the teachings we have today. So traditional approaches must also address a balance in the person as a whole. This requires not only the health factor, but other areas such as education and language. I know for myself, part of my healing is being able to go to, the sweat lodge and going to a Sundance, and just using my language. That's part of my healing too. And there was a time where even talking about residential schools was such a difficult process that I really couldn't do it at all. So part of my healing and part of my reconciliation is sharing my story, and to also, have young people hear that story and carry it forward, carry our ancestors' voices as well forward. And I think it's something we need to do as part of our healing. And it's not always easy for our families because of this, trauma that's embedded in who we are. And so what would I want to leave for a message for future generations? Well, I think I would want the next generation of Indigenous children to continue learning about their culture, to honor their ancestors for their resilience, to carry their ancestors' voices forward, and to be proud of who they are. And we know that the next generation will be our future leaders. So as an educator, I would say to them, get a good education so you can be prepared to create change for your people, your communities, and your nations. And, as an educator, that is an important piece because we know that there is a large gap in funding when it comes to our education system. And, we need to integrate our languages and culture and make sure they are part of the curriculum. And we know that's happening. And, there's a lot of different organizations that are working on, different pieces and training educators and training, people to know this so that it's part of the system. Because when I went to school, I never learned anything about treaties. And of course, learning about residential schools really never happened because most people didn't even believe that these things had actually happened during that time. So with that, I think, the message I want people to remember is, education is going to be key to our future. And for us to continue working on that and encourage the youth to stay in school and, moving forward, I know this can be difficult for a lot because of our, intergenerational impacts and things that we're dealing with on a daily basis. But they come and you come from resiliency. And I know the future will be much brighter for a lot of the younger generation of Indigenous youth. So with that, I just want to say miigwech for listening to me. And I hope that this helps you understand, some of the issues that we face as a result of residential schools and how can we work together, create partnerships for a better future for all Canadians, because this is not just an Indigenous issue. This is an issue for all Canadians. And it's important for all of us to understand, because then if we all understand and learn about this, then the future will be much better for everyone, all Canadians. So again, miigwech.